All right, holy cow, this is a great turnout. First off, thanks everybody for taking time out of your schedules. This is really important. And I'll just tell you, with capstone here yesterday, the boss devotes an entire day to making sure that he spends it with new generals and admirals who selectees to the SES ranks. We spent a lot of time talking about Russia yesterday, and so I appreciate you guys coming to the rest of the elements, the Army War College. Russia's not our friend. And you look at how bad we did in 2001 QDR. It said peace broke out, Russia's our friend. Don't know how we missed Putin's speech. It said, yeah, we're going to develop tactical nuclear weapons, make sure we offset the conventional battlefield shortcomings that we have, especially in the United States. So I don't know that they're our friends. So we have to see them as our adversaries. As you hear the boss talk about all the time, it's about getting the threat right, understanding the threat. You take everything in your discussions about the threat, and you can't be wrong. It's testimony, right? So, we go hiking. What can you do with a less reduced budget? You say, well, you just have to fix the threat first, and then we go ahead and lower the budget that we have for our strategic deterrent. These gentlemen here will tell you that I don't think that the threat's going to be anytime soon. Power torpedoes, power missiles. We've all seen Putin's videos. We've seen his speeches. Hopefully, you read about it. Certainly, boss talks about it. So I just want to tell you, thanks for taking the time to professionally improve yourselves here, get a better understanding of the threat. And again, gentlemen, thanks for coming down from the War College and spending time. This is, I think, our second night in the series for the TED Talks, if you will. Zach, thanks to put this together. So I'm going to get on the stage because I'm not a Russian expert. We can talk about the Green Bay Packers or something that's real expert on, but instead, we'll turn it over to Fred the first. But again, thanks for your time here and enjoy the discussion. All right, thanks. Seats up front too. Your seats. This isn't like church. You don't get to sit in the back pews. Fill over the front. Okay. So when we get the slides set up. So I'm Bob Hamilton. I'm here with Parker Frawley. We're going to tag team this. So I'm a professor of Eurasian Studies at the Army War College. And I retired last summer after 30 years in the Army, 22 of which the last 22 or so was spent as a Eurasian military officer. So, I tell people I love to talk about Russia. I'll go anywhere to talk about Russia. I was telling Parker last year, this time I was in Monterey at the Naval Postgraduate School to give us kind of a similar lecture on local Russian foreign policy. I'm especially thankful for the invitation to come to Offutt Air Force Base in February because that gives me a little more credibility when I say I'll go anywhere to talk about Russia. Going to Monterey in February that doesn't really give me much credibility when I say I will go anywhere to talk about Russia. There's a lot of interest in Russia now, obviously. So what I'm going to do, what I thought we would do is each of us will take about 15, 20 minutes to give you our thoughts on Russia. And I'm going to talk mostly about sources of kind of Russian foreign policy, national security policy behavior. Parker's going to talk more about coercion, deterrence, kind of implementation, operations. What do they do? So I'm a little bit more of the why, and he's a little bit more of the how. And then we're going to open it up to questions because I'm interested to hear what you all are interested in and what you think about Russia. So let's see if we can get the slides working.
They going? Not going? All right.
Yeah, there we go. So this is what I call kind of the fundamental dilemma about Russia. And that is when we in the West show resolve, when we're resolute in defending our interests, Russia sees that as threatening. And I don't think this is manufactured propaganda threats. This is, Russia actually sees these as things as threatening when we defend our interests with resolve. However, when the West looks to find ways to compromise with Russia, Russia sees that as weakness to be exploited. So it's kind of this is why Winston Churchill and others, said Russia is an enigma wrapped in a riddle. It's the original damned if you do, damned if you don't problem for us in dealing with Russia. And we've never been able to quite get it right. So if you could, to the next slide, please. So these are what I call the enduring characteristics of Russian foreign policy. And really, you can draw a thread back to at least the early 1800s, right? At least the period of Peter the Great. And these things haven't really changed. Even during the Soviet Union, you started to see kind of traditional Russian foreign policy behavior reassert itself after an initial fairly short period where the Soviet Union was very ideologically committed to a worldwide revolution. And then very quickly, these kind of traditional Russian foreign policy maxims reasserted themselves. One is this obsession with being acknowledged as a great power and being treated as a great power by other great powers. And that kind of speaks to the way Russia sees the world. Russia sees the world in a very, we would say, a 19th century kind of great power concert sort of way. And the Russian idea is that sovereignty is not an absolute, it's a variable. Great powers actually run the world. Great powers should have spheres of influence in which other great powers kind of stay out. And they're allowed to pursue their own interests. And smaller states that happen to be on the borders of great powers, their sovereignty is going to have to be a little constrained. And that's just a fact of geopolitical life. We tend not to see the world this way. Sometimes we act as if we do, but I think in general the United States and the West more generally see the world as more a collection of states, all of which enjoy sovereignty. We try to work out our differences through institutions. Yes, sometimes states pursue their hard security interests, but if they can do it without directly threatening, impacting, or to the detriment of another state, do it through institutions, we try to do that. Russia has had, for several hundred years, a deep and abiding sense of inferiority vis-a-vis the West. And it's something that almost anything Russia does in the world, in some way, especially when it relates to the West, but in some way it comes back to this idea that Russia somehow quite doesn't belong, it doesn't quite measure up to the West. And so we have to be careful. Mark and I were talking about this the other night. We veer back and forth between dismissing and belittling Russia, which is really not helpful, right? Saying things like, well, it's a second-rate power. Well, gosh, it's got a GDP the size of Denmark, or Denmark in the 90s as we announced it. Yeah, it has a bunch of nuclear weapons, but really, is it a power that we should be concerned about? That's not helpful, because it activates this inferiority complex. It causes Russia to do things to get our attention, essentially. Russia would always rather be a problem than be irrelevant. And then so we veer between that and then kind of hyperventilating over the latest thing the Russians have done, and casting it in terms maybe more threatening than it actually is. And then the third thing that I think has been a consistent theme of Russian foreign policy is a focus on hard power, military power, territorial security as the only things that really matter in international politics. Institutions are instruments, right, in the Russian view. Institutions like the United Nations, like the OSCE, are instruments through which great powers pursue their interests. The institutions themselves don't really have any independent effect except for their channels for great powers to pursue their hard security interests. Okay, so if we go to the next one, please. So this is another conversation we were having a few days ago. It reminded me of a Levada Center poll. If you're looking for good public opinion research on what the Russian people really think, there really is only one remaining source in Russia. It's the Levada Center. It's levada.ru. You probably cannot get it on the Nippernet from here, but because I know we can't for a while. But if you're on Wi-Fi or you're at home, and they have English language pages, they have all their surveys are in English. And they have done public opinion polling in Russia since the early 90s. And it's good, solid social science research. So Levada Center has been asking Russians since 1999 what they're ashamed of. So there have been 14 to 20 choices depending on the year they ask it. And they allow people to pick more than one. But the top choice every single year has always been, we're a great people in a rich country, but we permanently live in poverty and disorder. Right? So as Americans, we're tempted to say, well, there's poverty in the United States. Right? There's disorder in the United States. I would say two things. One, not on the scale that there is in Russia. Number two, it's not a permanent feature of American life. This is something that Russians would say is a permanent feature of Russian life, going back centuries. So it's the biggest country in the world. It's hugely rich in natural resources, but they've never been able to figure out a way to not have poverty and disorder, social disorder, political disorder, economic disruption as a permanent feature of Russian life. So it's this kind of, it's a schizophrenic worldview that it simultaneously asserts Russia's status as a great power and insists on a special role in the world on one hand, but laments Russia's backwardness on the other. And so it's something that is pervasive in kind of Russian public opinion. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I would call the view from Moscow. So a deeply insecure, fearful view of the world, right? And you can't talk to Russians without hearing about all the times they've been invaded, mostly from the West, right? They'll talk about the Poles in the 17th century. They'll talk about Napoleon in the 19th century. They'll talk about the Germans, the Nazis in the 20th century. Every once in a while, they'll throw out the intervention in the aftermath of the First World War by the US and the UK and other allies. And then for good measure, they'll take you back to the 13th century and the Mongol invasions, which came from the east. But nevertheless, there's this idea that the world is a really, really threatening place. Russia's position in it is not secure. And geographically, I mean, there's a reason for this worldview, right? If you stand in the Harz Mountains in Germany, basically between the Harz Mountains and the Ural Mountains in Russia, it's flat. There's no topographic feature that's over a few hundred meters high. So it's a very flat, open plain on Russia's western border. Its southern border is marked by insecurity in the Caucasus, Islamic extremism and fundamentalism. Its border with the Central Asian states. The Central Asian states have always been kind of a soft underbelly for Russia. So there are reasons for this worldview, but it is something that has been pervasive and it's been consistent in how Russia sees the world. So General Pete Zwack, who used to be our defense attaché in Moscow, talks about Russian threat perceptions as three categories: real, perceived, and contrived. And I think this is a really interesting way to look at it. We can all agree on that Russia faces actual threats. I just talked about kind of geographically what some of those are. But where we sometimes have trouble is differentiating between perceived and contrived. So there's certain things that we would not necessarily see as a threat, but Russia does, and they really see it as a threat. NATO enlargement, I think, is a great example. We tend to say, look, NATO doesn't threaten Russia. Okay. NATO is an institution; it's a collective security institution. It's for mutual defense. It is not, its expansion does not threaten Russia. In fact, by making the states along Russia's border more secure and making them democracies and market economies, which are kind of prerequisites to get into NATO, it actually helps Russia's security. Russia doesn't see it that way. Russia sees a hostile military alliance moving towards the border. That is a threat that we and the Russians will always disagree on. But they do, I believe it is a genuine fear. That Russia perceives a genuine fear of political subversion and possible a military threat from NATO enlargement. Doesn't mean, I'm not saying NATO shouldn't enlarge and shouldn't have enlarged. I'm saying that when we argue that Russia shouldn't see it as a threat, or we say, well, that's a contrived threat, they do that for propaganda purposes, I think we're making a mistake. And then the third category of threats are contrived. These are things that we know they're not a threat, they know they're not a threat, but they're useful for the Russian government to whip up public sentiment, public hysteria, nationalist sentiment. To differentiate between perceived and contrived is very hard for us, unless we're able to see the world through Moscow's eyes. But I think it's crucial, because if we mislabel perceived threats as contrived, if we assume that they don't really mean that when they do, then we could escalate with Russia through misperception or miscalculation. right? The Baltics are a great example of this. Certain things that we might do in the Baltics that we would assume Russia wouldn't see as a threat, well, they do. And if we label that as Russian propaganda or write it off, then we risk war by miscalculation or misconception. Second thing, the view out from Moscow is a real suspicious and cynical view of the motivations of states in war, especially Western states. When we say, hey, look, we just want Russia's neighbors to be peaceful, democratic, market economies, and things like the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the Maidan, the Second Revolution in Ukraine, which the Russians lump, and by the way, all the Arab Spring movements too, they lump under the rubric of color revolutions. They believe that those are not popular movements to overthrow corrupt and authoritarian governments. They believe those were orchestrated by the U.S. intelligence services to topple governments friendly to Russia. And they really believe that, and you're not going to convince them otherwise. I would say that the first three bullets lead to the fourth. The fact that Russia is always on the defensive, that Russia is always threatened, that the West really wants to destabilize, if possible, topple the Russian government. As preposterous as it seems to us, right? What interest does the United States or the West have in seeing a country the size of Russia, with that much, as diverse as Russia, with as many nuclear weapons as Russia, a failed state, right? That clearly is not in our interest, but many Russians believe that that's the U.S. goal. So that worldview leads them to run high risks, right? This is the idea that the only way Russia can equalize the balance between itself and the United States is to take risks in international politics. So you'll see them engage in behavior that we would think is too risky for the possible reward. There's even a theory, if you're interested in kind of political science theory, there's a theory called prospect theory that argues that when people feel they're in the domain of losses, so they actually got this by watching people in casinos, and they realize that when people are on a losing streak, they tend to be more risk acceptant. They tend to bet more to try to gain it all back. Prospect theory argues that this works in international politics too. When states, when countries believe that they're at a disadvantage, they're on a losing streak, they engage in risky behavior to try to get everything back in one move or one turn. And the quote comes from Olga Oliker, who's the head of the Russian program at CSIS. She used to be at RAND, and she, for my money, in my opinion, is one of the best Russia analysts out there. And what she says is Russia, all these things, the Russian worldview makes Russia hard to reassure and easy to escalate. In other words, there's not a lot that we can do or would do that would be enough to reassure Russia about our intentions vis-a-vis its security. But there are plenty of things that we would do that we don't see as threatening that Russia does that can cause escalation. So next, please. Okay. And I would argue that all of these factors, these kind of structural factors, the different worldviews of the United States and Russia, we just fundamentally see the world in different ways, lead to fairly predictable stages in relations between Russia and the U.S. And this, actually, I modified this, but the original argument comes from Keir Giles, who's at Chatham House in the UK. And he says, so look, it's euphoria, realism or pragmatism, disillusionment, crisis, reset. And if you think about it, we've been through at least three of these stages since the end of the Cold War. The early 90s, you had the euphoria of Yeltsin, right? Yeltsin, the Democrat, Russia was going to be a democratic country, and it was going to be a market economy, and it was going to join the West. And then we moved, I think, into pragmatism or realism. Hey, Yeltsin may not be the person we thought he was, and Russia may not be the country we thought he was, with the 1993 attack on the White House, the Russian White House, right, between Yeltsin and his government. The 96 election, when Yeltsin was reelected with a lot of U.S. help, in an election that probably wasn't free and fair. And then we moved into disillusionment for the Russians in 1998 with the financial crisis, the defaulting on IMF loans, the devaluation of the ruble. We moved into crisis in 1999 with Kosovo. Kosovo was a crisis for the Russians. Who, as preposterous as it seems to us, many of them felt Kosovo was a dress rehearsal for doing the same thing to Russia using Chechnya as the justification. And then we had a reset post 9/11, right? This was when George Bush said, I looked into his eyes, right? And he was able to get a sense of his soul, which I'm sure he later regretted. Condoleezza Rice in her book said she heard him say that and immediately said he's going to regret that. John McCain said, famously, I looked into his eyes too, and all I saw was KGB. And so we had a reset post 9/11, right? And I won't go through, the whole stage of that reset, but the crisis of that one was the war in Georgia in 2008, and then we had the Obama reset in 2009 with the misspelled button, and the crisis of that one was the war in Ukraine in 2014. So now my argument is we're stuck in crisis. We can't reset. Russia doesn't want to reset. We can't reset. Usually what happens is a new president comes in and he says, you know what, my predecessor, he messed the Russia relationship up. I can fix this. Our administration right now, for a lot of reasons that I don't want to get into politically, is not in a position to do that. So our president can't reset with Russia. So we've been stuck in a kind of a crisis state, a frozen crisis since 2014, since early 2014 in Ukraine. Where we go from here, I don't know. But it may take a change of leadership either here or there, or some sort of external shock to cause us to reset the relationship. But no reset ever lasts, because the structural factors reassert themselves, the different worldviews between the US and Russia reassert themselves, and eventually the relationship degrades to the point where it's in crisis. So next, please. So here's what I would say in dealing with Russia, and then I'll turn it over to Parker. What should we do? We should be resolute but predictable. I started by saying when we're resolute, right, the Russians see that as threatening. We still need to defend our own interests. We need to understand the Russian worldview, Russian threat perceptions, and take those into account, but that doesn't mean giving Russia a veto. So we need to be resolute, but we need to be predictable strategically, right? We don't need to do things that come as unexpected shocks to them, because they already see many things as threatening that we would not see as threatening, we don't mean as threatening. So that's one. Don't allow the Russians to goad us, provoke us, bait us. They're really good at this, and they love to do it. And so keep the emotion out of it, I would say. Keep our language level and pragmatic. Don't ever, the euphoria stage of Keir Giles's, pattern of Russian-American relations, we should try to stay out of that stage. And I think the Obama administration in their reset did. Right? There was no euphoria. It was a very pragmatic, interest-based reset. We have to challenge the Russian disinformation. We have to. And it's hard, because it takes them 30 seconds to make up a line. It takes us 3 days of staff officers at some command working hours a day to refute it. We get into the Q&A, we can talk about this. I dealt with this when I was in Geneva, working on a Syria support group with or against the Russians, and I dealt with it when I was running the Russian deconfliction cell at OIR. It's a daily thing. But we have to, some of the things that they say are so egregious that we have to debunk them and disprove them. This kind of goes back to the first bullet too. We have to communicate, I think, with the Russians and tell them where our important or vital interests are, they cannot be threatened. And then we have to enforce them when they transgress, because they'll find ways to come right up to those red lines and maybe go a little across and just gauge the reaction. And I think the final thing is we have to be careful in our language about things that happen inside of Russia. So we see it as our duty to call them out when they have elections that aren't free and aren't fair. That's fine. In the same way that we do to partners and allies, and other, for instance, Georgia had an election recently. We were fairly critical of the Georgian election. So we can still do that, but we should be careful to avoid the perception that we're trying to undermine the legitimacy of the Russian government, or the sovereignty of the Russian state, because that's a genuine Russian feeling. They believe that that's what we're trying to do. And we also have to resist their attempts to erode the sovereignty of their neighbors. Right? They do this habitually to the Baltics, to Georgia, to Ukraine, to Moldova. They do it in the Balkans. They've done it in Montenegro. So we have to resist that. We have to call that out, and we have to help those partners deal with those Russian attempts to erode their sovereignty and destabilize them. Next. Okay, so that's my part. I'll turn it over to Parker here for lessons learned.
Good morning, I'm Colonel Parker Frawley. I came along mostly just to carry Bob's bags. My bona fides aren't quite what Bob's are. I'm lifelong Army aviator, career-long Army aviator, Apache pilot. Just finished up at War College last year as a student. Turned over to the faculty. And this is my first opportunity to do something like this. My kind of Russia background, I was an Olmsted Scholar in Moscow, studied at Moscow State University, got my master's degree there. And then the assignment before I came to the War College, I was a special assistant and advisor for the EUCOM commander, both General Breedlove and then subsequently General Scaparrotti, with the former Soviet Union as part of my portfolio. So that's kind of my background and my insight on this. So what I would like to do is talk to you a little bit about what Russia is doing and trying to do, and what we might do in response or to kind of get ahead of that. We'll talk a little bit about deterrence. I feel I'm underqualified, seriously underqualified to talk about deterrence in this room, and I acknowledge that. So we'll touch on a couple of the key aspects of deterrence, just to, but not very deeply, because I'm certain that everyone in here is more well versed in deterrence than I am. So I have a little laundry list here of just a few things where Russia has kind of pushed the bounds of what we would consider acceptable behavior in the international arena, and really what they've learned from that. So you had the Estonian cyber attack in April 2007. Lots of smoke, no fire. First of all, there's the attribution issue. There's the determination at that point in time, especially, although this persisted today, what is an attack in the cyber realm? How do we define that? What does that mean to us? We've gotten a little better on that, but I know that the water is still pretty murky on that. So no real long-term consequences for the Russians. The Estonians did a tremendous job of hardening their systems, hardening their society, deterrence by denial, and so that's been kind of the consequence of that action. But in terms of Russia, they didn't really have to pay for that. Russia-Georgian conflict in August 2008, a lot of strong words, but Georgia wasn't a NATO ally. Certainly they had significantly stood by our side, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. But when we look at the asymmetry of interests between what Russia saw in Georgia and what we saw in Georgia, no real long-term consequences for the Russians. They're still there in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia, kind of expanding their space and handing over Russian passports to the citizens there. 2014, the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Donbass. There were some sanctions that were thrown out there, but initially those sanctions primarily from the United States. Our European allies got on board with a few of the lower level sanctions, but Russia's a major trading partner of theirs, and so they were a little reluctant to upset the boat, and so those sanctions did not have a great deal of impact initially, and I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about Russia's propensity for suffering as we move on here. So then the shoot down of MH17, and a lot of Dutch citizens were killed, and the EU jumped in the sanctions bandwagon pretty hard. Those sanctions, the sanctions that we had initiated, the EU came on, and some additional sanctions, coupled with the low hydrocarbon prices of that time, put a pretty good dent in the Russian economy. And there were some consequences for that. We saw automobile manufacturers, so Ford, Fiat, have pulled out of Russia. You have seen now, interestingly enough, what has happened because of that, the consequence of that is the Russian native car industry, so Zhigulis, Ladas, those sorts of things, that car industry was on its last leg. And now it's all rejuvenated. And they're selling Ladas again, they're selling Zhigulis again. It's the exact same Zhiguli you could buy in 1963, but they're selling them again. And so the Russian native automobile industry, just as an example, because it's happened across the board with their manufacturing, this has been a real shot in the arm for some of that stuff that's native, native created. Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, the chemical attacks in the UK. Interestingly enough, we saw some expulsions, some diplomatic expulsions, a little tit for tat. This was a chemical attack on the soil of a NATO ally that killed British nationals. And remarkably enough, we got a couple more sanctions, a little diplomatic tit for tat, and not a whole lot else. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about some of the economics of that here shortly. And then just the Kerch Strait interdiction. The United States we're pretty adamant that freedom of navigation in international waterways is one of those things that we plant our flag on that. We will steam around the South China Sea all day long. Now I got it. We don't have a lot of interest in steaming into the Kerch Strait, but the principle of freedom of navigation, kind of some harsh words, and they're still holding those Ukrainian sailors, and they're still restricting the Kerch Strait, which is an international waterway, by treaty between the Ukraine and Russia. They are still closing off Kerch Strait. Next slide, please. So this is the lesson. Not a lot of exceptions. They have determined that as they go to seek their foreign policy objectives, they're willing to pay the consequences that thus far we, the United States, our allies, those people that the countries out there that at least try to abide by what we say are the normal rules of international discourse, they're willing to pay those consequences. Now, the interesting thing, so if you talk to Russians, and Bob alluded to it a little bit, I like to say Russians revel in martyrdom. So they love to embrace the suck and tell you how much they love to embrace the suck. It's just, and so if you're President Putin, and in some way, shape, or form, because of your actions, there are international sanctions, and those international sanctions have started to really hit the middle class. If you could find an external boogeyman to blame that on, Russians will endure that until they're eating grass. They just will. And when you talk to them, they will talk to you about, well, the decadent West, you have no idea how to suffer. We suffered at the hands of the Nazis. We suffered it. Bob went over the litany of history lesson. I won't. Because they're able to pin that on someone external, it's a point of pride for them. We can suffer more than you can ever possibly comprehend. And they're happy to do it. So what are the Russian foreign policy objectives? What is it that they're trying to achieve? Well, number one is security. And it doesn't matter if it's the United States, if it's UK, if it's France, if it's Russia. Security for their people, security for their sovereign space, for the lines that they draw on the ground that says these are our borders. That security, from their perspective, also requires the ability to project a buffer space that gives them that security, that ensures that security. And so that is this regional influence, both in the former Soviet Union, to a little, and I don't want to paint the former Soviet Union all in one brush, because the Baltics are a little different story. But that buffer that's both in the Soviet Union, but also in those areas that they see as strategic footholds. So you take Syria as an example. Yes, the naval base in Tartu is important. It is. But so is having Assad as an ally. And if I gave you guys a piece of paper and I said, write down all of the allies and partners of the United States, you'd be writing for a while. If I said, write down all the allies and partners of Russia, you'd be a pretty daggone short list. So that kind of disparity in who they can count on, it was important for them to go into Syria to prove to an ally and to the rest of the world that's watching that we're going to step up and support an ally. So that influence in those regions, again, I talked about the Baltics is a little bit of a different story, but you do have to keep Kaliningrad in mind. The exclave of Kaliningrad is Russian sovereign territory. It's not a something that is kind of like Crimea, really nice. I mean, they certainly consider Crimea as Russian sovereign territory, but they won't go to war over Crimea. They'll go to war over Kaliningrad. The next thing that they want is, and Bob mentioned this, it's recognition as a great power in a multipolar world. It's not just a great power that is second fiddle to the unipower, the unipolar power of the United States. It's a great power in a multipolar world. They want to be a nation of consequence. When the United States makes a decision on the international stage, Russia wants to make sure that the President of the United States goes, I wonder how Russia's going to react to this. That's success for them. And if you take a quick gander back to, Bob mentioned Kosovo in 1999, which I think was the nadir of Russian influence post-Cold War. That's when Russia said, that's it, we can't trust the West. And up until, I think, last year, they had increased their defense spending every year since 1999. If you look back at that moment right there, Russia saw themselves as utterly without influence in the international arena. And frankly, that's exactly the way we treated them. They do not want that. And so if you measure from 1999 until today, that should give you an indication of why Vladimir Putin enjoys high popularity ratings. Because it is not 1999. When we do something in the international stage, if we are certain that Russia is going to put their foot down about it, we have a little bit of a second thought. And in 1999, it was Russia who? Economic prosperity. Now that may you may think, well, that's kind of in contravention to the absorption of these sanctions and the inability of Russia to build a foundational an economy that has strong foundational roots. It's very, very hydrocarbon oriented. Depending on the studies that you look at, about 65 to 70% of their total economy is in some way, shape, or form connected to hydrocarbon extracts. So it's very, very sensitive to those movements in the international, the movements on the markets for those hydrocarbons. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about some of our deterrents. And then finally, stop that NATO-EU enlargement, because they don't see that as simply the West looking to bring other partners in and expand these kind of liberal ideals within Europe. They look at it as a threat. And we say, well, NATO it's a defensive alliance. And Russia says, defending against who? Because we're the only other people in the room here that aren't part of the party. So it's a concept of understanding from their perspective the criticality of that and stopping that enlargement, because they see it as a threat. So what we see with Russia in this, because it really is a scattershot, I mean, all these things, that list that you saw up there, you look at the meddling in the elections, you look at the riots in Charlottesville, and then the whole Facebook thing after that happened. All of these things, you try to discern what's the pattern. What are they trying to achieve by this? Well, I think it's kind of let's throw it at the wall and see what sticks. It's an all-and option that the Russians are trying to do. Well, we certainly can't counter that. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources, and we don't want to apply something to it. So, as Bob mentioned, and I think this is absolutely critical, set our red lines and adhere to them. Most of the stuff that's out there, though interesting, is noise. And we've got to figure out what of that noise is important enough for us to respond to, and what is simply noise. Bob said that Russians would rather be a problem than irrelevant. Well, some of that stuff, we are better off just letting them be irrelevant. Next slide, please. So, Russia practices cross-domain coercion. And this is a term that Dmitry Trenin started throwing around, which I think fits perfectly. And that's you know, they want to achieve something in one sphere or one sector, and they use coercive methods in another to try to simply disrupt your course of action and weaken you across the board. Well, the way to respond to that is this cross-domain deterrence. And again, you guys are very familiar with horizontal deterrence. It's kind of the same concept as horizontal deterrence. I don't have to escalate, or I'm sorry, horizontal escalation. I'll get my terminology right here. I don't have to escalate vertically. I can escalate horizontally to signal to the Russians that what they are doing, their behavior is unacceptable. So a couple things, I mean, what deterrence by denial, you guys know what that means. Deterrence by denial in this factor has a much lower risk of escalation with the Russians. It is generally defensive in nature, and not only does it have the direct benefits of potentially deterring the Russians because it keeps them from achieving their objectives vis-a-vis the West and the United States, but it also strengthens us overall. So what are some examples of this? Well, it's strengthening our infrastructure. Not so much our roads and our bridges, but it's our power grids. It's our computer security network. It's the integrity of our electoral process. We need to do this stuff anyway. Whether Russia's out there meddling in the way that they are, or whether that adversary is China, these are things that we need to do anyway. So we're going to get some residual benefits out of that. But what we need to understand is that some of the things that we do that we consider deterrence by denial are looked at a little bit differently by the Russians, and these do bring some risk of escalation. And specifically, I'm talking about the enhanced forward presence you see with NATO in the Baltic nations and in Poland right now, as well as the rotational units. So there's a couple things at work here. I think we would all acknowledge that a couple battle groups, that is battalion plus size elements that are in the vaults in Poland, and then this rotational brigade that goes through an aviation brigade and an ABCT that goes through Poland with some elements that go both to the Baltics and to the Balkans. Yeah, that's not going to make a dent for the 140,000 Russian soldiers that are in the Western Military District. I mean, as much as those tankers love to stand up there and talk about how awesome they are, I'm pretty sure that is not going to keep the Russians from taking Riga if they want. So how many, just a quick little show of hands, how many people read the RAND study that said the Russians could take Riga in 60 hours? Yeah. Why? Why would they, did anyone at RAND ever step back and say, why do they want Riga? What is the purpose for that? The Baltics weren't a comfortable possession for the Soviet Union for the decades between, after the war, when the Baltics became part of the Soviet Union. They never fit in. The guerrilla warfare that they would have to endure to keep the Baltics is something that they would not be able to succeed at. So when we send the enhanced forward presence battle groups and the rotational brigade into Poland and into the Baltics, the Russians don't look at this as deterrence by denial. They look at it as a beachhead. This is an ability for NATO, the United States, the West, to provide something that lights the way, guides the way, that is a potential threat to Russia. It's within that, as Bob talked about, there's a great big plain in western Russia that's very, very easy to drive across. We're not going to invade Russia with an EFP battle group or the rotational brigade, but they can certainly set conditions for us to conduct RSO&I and bring forces in. Do I think we're going to invade Russia? No. Does anyone in here think that we will? I doubt it. But the Russians cannot see the logic of why we feel it's necessary to put forces in the Baltics, because from their perspective, they have no desire to take the Baltics. Disrupt them? Yes. Disrupt the United States and NATO's plans and kind of be a pain in our backside? Yes. But what is that? How does that equate to putting battle groups in the Baltics? So some of this deterrence by denial is a little bit more escalatory, but at the end of the day, most of that is something that's simply going to strengthen who we are. So the key piece here is talking about this deterrence by punishment. So again, terms up there that you guys are all familiar with, but I think that there is a way that we can get after this that will help us determine what Vladimir Putin and the Russians hold dear and put it at risk, because that's really what this deterrence by punishment is about. It's very risky because if you place something of high enough value at risk, there is a high risk of escalation. So that comes with both clarity of communication and our intent, making sure the Russians understand what it is that we're putting at risk and what are those red lines that if they cross will put us in a position where we take action against that thing that's at risk. So I'm just going to talk through a couple examples. These are not, these are just suggestive, because you can shoot holes in these, but they have some merit and they're the ways that you need to think about how we can deter across this, this cross-domain coercion. So I talked about Russia's dependence on the hydrocarbons. So an example, Bulgaria gets 90% of their gas. Bulgaria, a NATO member, gets 90% of their gas from Russia. Right now on the Balkan Peninsula, there are 2 LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas terminals. There are 8 planned, but simply not the resources necessary to get those 8 break ground and get them built up. So low interest loans from the United States or grants from the United States to help build liquefied natural gas terminals in Europe to reduce the dependency on Russian gas is a way forward. It hits them in the pocketbook. Now, can we ever bring gas into terminals that's less expensive than Russian gas? No. All the infrastructure's there, it's plentiful, it's easy to get to, but right now, most of our allies and partners have no option. So maybe they wouldn't mind paying a little bit more for a gas supply that is not coercive in nature, but they don't have an option. They get their gas from Russia because that's where the pipelines come from. So something that helps give our allies and partners some options, gets them out from underneath the umbrella of that coercion that Russia is able to put against them, and also hits Russia in the pocketbook, is a way that we could look at deterring Russia from acting and look at making sure that when they do take actions, they're less effective. Right now, European companies, Western European companies, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, have just invested 11 billion euros in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's a pipeline that runs directly under the Baltic Sea from Russia straight into Germany. This is not a reduction of Europe's demands for Russian gas. It's a significant increase of Europe's demands for Russian gas, bypassing transit countries like Poland, like Ukraine, areas where, and many of those countries, specifically Ukraine, much of the money that they earned was those transit fees. Russia's cutting them out of that market. And our ally, our partners, our allies and partners in Europe are financing their ability to cut those countries out of the market and increase European dependency on gas. Perhaps we can put some pressure on our allies and partners for some other options for gas. Maybe the Nord Stream 2 isn't the best way to go. Now, candidly speaking, I think the Nord Stream 2, I think that ship sailed. But those are examples where we see that we are not doing all that we can do to remove the coercion that Russia is able to exercise. Another great example. In March 2018, about 2 weeks, 1 or 2 weeks after Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned, Russia floated 4 billion worth of euro bonds. That's to pay for their sovereign debt, their hard currency sovereign debt. Over half, almost 60% of those bonds were purchased in the UK. So if you want to put the levers to Russia and help them understand that we will not abide by their actions, you cannot, in a country where you just use chemical weapons, then buy $4 billion worth of euro bonds, or 4 billion euro bonds. So we're sending mixed signals, and frankly, Russia is not paying a price, as I showed on that earlier slide, they're not paying a price for their transgressions. So another Another thing that we could think of is expropriation of intellectual capital out of Russia. Right now, when we've kind of got into these diplomatic tit for tats with the Russians, we've made the visa regime extremely difficult for any Russians to come into the United States. But what if we change that so that our ability to facilitate a brain drain, if you will, to bring some of those experts that we need. I mean, we talk about we don't have enough STEM education here in the United States. We're not producing the right people necessary to drive our economy. Well, perhaps we could lure them out of Russia. A visa program that is set on identifying certain skill sets and bringing them out of Russia so that they can come to the United States or to the West and help us with those requirements. I mean, if you look at some of the financial difficulties that we're seeing in Russia right now, a life in the West where you're making pretty decent money as a physicist or an engineer or something like that, that might be pretty attractive. But instead, we kind of ham-handedly tightened the entire visa regime and has made it very, very difficult for us to bring in any Russians on work visas. So now stuff that is a little bit more tricky. See down there at the bottom, we talked about economic security, political security, and personal security as those key things that we can potentially put at risk. So President Putin is worth somewhere between 70 and $200 billion. It's a fair amount of cash. A little bit more than Bob's retirement, will probably exceed mine as well. He does that on a salary of $133,000 a year. We have the ability, I am certain of it, to reveal to the Russian people the level of corruption and deceit and lack of transparency that were necessary for President Putin to amass that fortune. To reveal to the Russian people the money that the oligarchs have squirreled out of the country and have in offshore accounts. The Panama Papers did a little bit of that for us. And frankly, there was actually an article in Foreign Policy yesterday that talked about specifically that the Russian people who are kind of suffering from some of this, from some of the economic downturn, that President Putin and the government, more so the government, aren't doing as successful a job of the external boogeyman anymore, and they're starting to see this socioeconomic disparity between where they stand and the fact that the oligarchs don't seem to be suffering at all. If any of you have had the opportunity to visit Moscow, there are a lot of Volgas and Ladas and Zhigulis driving around. But I bet when I lived there, I saw 20 Bentleys a day. It's pretty remarkable. The Russian people see this as well. And so if we were to communicate to the leadership in Russia that we have information, this is the deterrence by punishment, that we have information about the lack of transparency, this is something that we could say, listen, we're not going to release this because the escalatory risk of this is very high. If we put the regime in danger, how they lash out, I don't want to predict. The escalatory risk is very high. But if you put it at risk and you communicate that it's at risk, yes, sir.
Everybody can see your seats. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, sir. Thanks for coming in, sir. If you put it at risk and communicate that it's at risk, it is leverage for influence on the behavior of the Russian state. Again, high risk, but high reward with something like this. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the information campaign, and Bob talked about our countering misinformation. I think that from a practical perspective, this goes a little bit back to deterrence by denial, but it shades between denial and punishment. We are slow, ineffective, and scattershot at countering misinformation. Slow, I got. It's I forget the adage exactly, but a lie is around the world before the truth leaves the barrel or something like that. Slow, I've got. But our inability to stay on message, to focus a message, and to create something that is coherent in one single organization, much less whole of government, much less multinational. We're not particularly good at it. So I believe that we should create an interagency, multinational organization solely tasked with fighting the misinformation. Doesn't have to be only Russia focused. I think that there are other applications for it, but it's not propaganda. It's the truth, getting the truth out there. An organization that kind of spans the breadth of whole of government, brings in our allies and partners with this, and is able to turn the truth quickly and a focused message. So where do those messages go? Well, they go a lot of places. They certainly go to our internal audiences in the United States. They go to our international countries, those countries that Russia is trying to influence. But interestingly enough, when we cut the budgets for Radio Free Europe and RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we kind of ceded some of that information capacity. But the targets today, yes, the targets today are in Russia and in the surrounding countries, but it's also in the Russian diaspora that is spread throughout the United States and throughout Europe. These people are extremely influential at home. Extremely influential at home. So they certainly send money home, but just as importantly, they have this network of friends and contacts that they keep in touch with. So something that we used to influence them that could feed its way back into Russia. Because as you know, they dominate the airwaves with their television. It's very difficult to get into that. The electromagnetic spectrum within Russia, they largely control. So putting up great big radio transmitters on the border with East Germany, like we did in the good old days, that's going to be less effective. But targeting information against those parties that can then carry that information into Russia and are influential within the state is an effective way that we can get after that. So I'm just kind of throwing some things out there that again, not prescriptive in nature, more suggestive. There are ways that we can get after this and deter some of this coercion, either through punishment or denial, that keeps us from being so utterly reactive to everything that Russia does. So when Russia sends 2 blackjack bombers down to Venezuela, we spin for some time about that. Really? 2 blackjack bombers? Well, they were in Venezuela for a long time. Yeah, it's because they were broken and they couldn't take off. I mean, this is Russia. They had to send 6 tugboats with the Kuznetsov, thank you, to get it into the Eastern Med. Then they sailed it back, put it in dry dock. The dry dock sunk. As it was sinking, a crane fell over onto it and crashed through 6 decks of their only aircraft carrier. And that's not to say that they're Keystone Cops. But we've really got to choose about what those things are that we react to, what they allow, what they force us to spend our bandwidth on, and what we just go, yeah, it's Russia. Okay, so with that, we'll start some Q&A if you guys have anything. I certainly appreciate your attention and listening to me ramble on. Bob, you can come on up and we'll jump on what we got.